Thank you.
Right. Good morning, ladies and gentlemen. Always nice to see you here. Learn a bit of Torah together on a Tuesday morning, bright and early. We're looking at Sefer Bereshis Be'iyun. We're looking in depth into Sefer Bereshis. And I want to try and show you how in Sefer Bereshis, the seeds of the whole Torah really are rooted in Sefer Bereshis in many different ways. That Sefer Bereshis contains, in a sense, the DNA of the whole unfolding of Jewish history and the development of Klal Yisrael. And we've looked at several aspects of that. But this Shabbos, as I was listening to Kriyas HaTorah, I was thinking of our Shir here this morning on Tuesday, because there's a fascinating topic in Parshas Matos, which really raises several very fascinating questions, where really, unless you've understood Sefer Bereshis, and particularly Parshas Lech Lecha, unless you've understood it properly, you can't really understand what's happening. So I'd like to learn with you a parsha briefly, a parsha from Parshas Matos from a few days ago, and connect it to Parshas Bereshis and show you how Chazal understood something which I think is quite important for understanding, particularly connected to the land of Israel and our understanding of the land of Israel in a certain way. Okay, that's my general introduction. The topic I have in mind is in Bamidbar chapter 32, which is the story of the 2.5 tribes, Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. So Bnei Gad and Reuven got together. Why particularly these two tribes is maybe a separate story, but 2 out of the 12 tribes got together and they came to Moshe Rabbeinu with an extraordinary request. At the end of the story, Moshe Rabbeinu adds on Chatzi Shevet Menashe, adds on half the tribe Menashe, who didn't make a request at all. This was Moshe Rabbeinu's own addition. If we have some time, we'll speak about that maybe later on. But let's first look at the main story here. Let's just think for a minute, big picture. Where are the Jewish people located in Parshas Matos? So the pasuk says that they are Ba'arvois Moav, Al Yardein Yerecha. What does that mean? So some of you may have been to the Dead Sea. If you've ever been to the Dead Sea, so our part of the Dead Sea is the western bank of the Dead Sea, is available to us, and that's where the hotels are, that's where the beaches are, and that's where we usually drive. Our access to the Dead Sea is from the west. But if you look over the Dead Sea, on the other side of the Dead Sea, what can you see? You see some mountains. What are those mountains? That is Jordan, the country of Jordan. Moab. What do you say?
Hare Moab.
Hare Moab. Yes, Dina has been studying her biblical geography well. And the mountains of Moab, right? So the mountains of Moab are on the eastern bank of the Jordan River. So when the pasuk says that the Klal Yisrael are camped, Ba'arvois Moav, it means the plains of Moab, which is next to the mountains. Al Yardein, on the Jordan River. Yerecha. Yerecha means opposite Yericho. In other words, thank you very much. In other words, this is, if Klal Yisrael have been traveling for 40 years in the Midbar, this is their final stop. This is this week's Parsha Maseh. We're going to get a whole list of the 42 stops that Klal Yisrael camped during the 40 years in the Midbar. And number 42, the final stop, is Al Yardein Yerecha. So you can imagine the entire Jewish people are all camped on the eastern bank of the River Jordan. And within a very short time, within about 6 weeks, they're going to cross the River Jordan under the leadership of Yeshua and enter the land of Israel and set about capturing the city of Jericho. All this is going to happen very, very soon. But at the moment, they're on the plains of Moab, if you're sitting on the plains of Moab on the banks of the River Jordan, you can see the land of Israel just really not far away, maybe 20. Many of you have seen the River Jordan. The River Jordan is not the Mississippi, you understand what I mean? The River Jordan is not miles wide. It's only about, I don't know, 30, 40 meters wide. It's not a massive river. And you can see Israel. So here they are really, literally on the threshold of the land of Israel. And on the threshold of the land of Israel, they've reached, in a certain sense, their destination. They know that Moshe is going to die, Yeshua is going to take over, and that's it. The whole of Sefer Devarim only lasts for 5 weeks, the whole Sefer Devarim. So as soon as Sefer Devarim has been said, Moshe Rabbeinu dies, Yeshua takes over, and that's where we're at. So what Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, 2 of the 12 tribes, they come with the following request. Let's have a look at some psukim here, which are very fascinating. Okay. I've written here Transjordan. I've entitled this Transjordan, Bnei Gad, Bnei Reuven, Parshas Matos. So what does the pasuk say? Pasuk says, Umikne Rav Hoyo. See if I can get this right. Second. Umikne Rav Hoyo lebnei Reuven lebnei Gad otzum ma'ot. Right, these were the mikne. What is mikne? The mikne is the sheep and cattle. The sheep and cattle of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven were many. In other words, they had massive herds and flocks of sheep and cattle. So what Vayiru is Eretz Yazer and Eretz Gilad. I'm reading the pasuk which I've highlighted, and they saw the land of Yazer and Gilad. Right, these were 2 of the cities they had just captured. The Hine HaMokah Mikne, and they saw something very interesting, that the land which they were sitting on now was a Makom Mikne. How would you translate that? These were fertile grazing lands, right? And here they've got a multiple amount of sheep and cattle. Exactly why Reuven and Gad would have been in possession of more sheep and cattle than anybody else is not entirely clear. It's true they had just fought battles against Sichon and Og and Midian, and they had taken the spoils of war, but presumably the spoils of war had been distributed equally throughout the whole of Klal Yisrael. So what was it that they had that other people didn't have? And the answer seems to be, according to Chazal, that they didn't, in fact, have more than anybody else had, but in some way, their sheep and cattle were very important to them, were very precious to them. And they felt that the best way to cultivate and preserve the wealth that they had come by would be this land. So what did they say? Vayovo b'nei Gad b'nei Reuven, vayomru el Moshe, ataros v'divo. Right, this is Mikneh. Right, so he says. So what are they asking? So the request comes here. Vayomru, and they said, Imatzadu chein beinecha. If you want to do us a favor, Yutan ha'oretz hazos la'avodecha la'achuza. Right? Let us inherit here on this in Transjordan. Al ta'avirenu es hayad. Let us not go across the River Jordan. So I want you to think about that for a second. In other words, what are they saying? They're saying, look, we've just got through these battles with Sichon and Og and Midian. We've just conquered this land. Why should we now move on into Israel and abandon this land, having conquered it, when it could be extremely useful for us? You know what? We will stay here in Transjordan with our sheep and cattle, and the rest of you can go on into the land of Israel. I just want to reflect on this request just for a minute. Let's assume for a minute that Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven were not idiots and they were not wicked people, and at least many of them were thinking people. And I want you to imagine that for 40 years they've been in the Midbar, and what have they been? And in the Midbar, they've been learning Torah from Moshe, from Aaron, they've been eating the mon. And what have they been dreaming of? They've been dreaming of Eretz Yisrael, of the land of Israel, which is the land promised to Avraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov. They knew that both Yaakov and Yosef had exhibited such love for the land of Israel that they had instructed that they be buried in the land of Israel. They knew the story of Bereshis. They knew that it had been promised to Avraham Avinu. They knew also from the Torah that this was a place, Hamokom asher yivcha Hashem Elokecho.
I think we've lost other people hearing me. We seem to have lost Rabbi Kimche.
Yeah, it must be his internet.
Yes. He's left. I'm sure he'll try to rejoin. My apologies to everyone. We've had a good run over the last few months.
Looks like you'll have to fill in, Ellie, for Rabbi Kimche. Why not?
It's very much a last resort. He's probably switched his phone off as well. Yes, have you been cut off, Rabbi? Oh. Okay, I'll be off the phone then. Thank you. Bye. Well, as you know, Rabbi Kimche lives in Eva HaYarden in Efrat. And being where it is, he suffered a power cut. And so he's going to try and rejoin us on his telephone. So let's give him a moment. He'll try to get through connecting to Zoom through his cell phone. Ah, I see him. Neve Daniel, Hadassah Fuchs says, is in the same situation. Looks like there's some problem over the green line. Oh, he was there. Ah, he's there again.
Can you see me or hear me?
Oh, I certainly
No, I
hear
can't
you.
hear you. I can't hear you. Try again. Can you...
See where you are. I don't see you.
Can anyone see me or hear me?
Hear you,
I
yes.
can't see anybody. This might take a minute for my phone to put it together.
Yes, we see you now.
You can hear me?
I hear you and I see you. I presume others do as well.
Okay. All right. So so in that case, we'll continue with the phone until the electricity is restored.
Okay, there's a diminished picture
Okay.
of you over here, which may mean that the screen share will be quite small as well. Just a little warning, I can only see a half-size square of you through your cell phone. Okay.
Okay, look, you've seen me before. You can...
Drifting. Seems to have lost him again on. He's still with us on the participant list. It's out again. Okay.
Okay, let's try this again.
Yes.
Can you hear me?
Yes. We can hear you. Say again.
Yes?
Yes, at the moment. Yes.
Okay. Right. So this is a bit of a better signal. I'm on my phone now. I've moved to a different room and I've got a better signal. But I'm not sure whether you guys can, because the screen has got frozen again. I'm afraid these are the problems of technology, the difficulties of technology. Can anybody in the share give me a sign of life of some sort? I can see you say something. I can't hear anybody saying anything.
Yeah, hi.
We're here.
Eliane, are you around? Shirley,
Yes.
are you there?
We can hear you and
Yeah.
see you.
Okay, continue on.
We see you, we hear you.
Yes. Carry on.
Okay, all right.
No, we don't.
Okay. So I'm going to go ahead with the shir without the text. You'll have to just trust me. That's what's written in the passage.
Yeah.
But the parsha that we're looking at is, if you think about it just for a couple of minutes, the request of the two tribes, Gad and Reuven, sounds to be ridiculous, right? Imagine for 40 years they've been dreaming of coming to Eretz Yisrael, and where are they now? They're totally on the threshold, within a stone's throw of the land of Israel. They're just about to enter the land of Israel. And what do they say to Moshe Rabbeinu? They say, you know what? We've just had a look at this land here, in Transjordan, and it's nice green grass. You know what? We like green grass because it's good for our sheep and cattle. We'll stay here. We're Moichel Eretz Yisrael. We're willing to forego our portion in the land of Israel. For what? For some green grass. This is maybe the origin of the grass is always green on the other side. So they were on the other side. They were on the other side of the Jordan. They saw the green grass and they said, right, this is where we're going to stay. Now, the truth is, that request as it stands really sounds so ridiculous as to be absurd, right? Well, they want to stay in Chutz La'aretz because of some green grass. Now, I do know that there are lots of pro-Aliyah speakers who use this story as a sort of an example of people who are so comfortable in Chutz La'aretz that they prefer to stay with the green grass in Chutz La'aretz and not come into the land of Israel. I know that this story is used in that sense, but actually, if you think about it even for a minute, it doesn't make sense to understand the parsha that way. It just doesn't make sense. Well, really, they're going to stay in Chutz La'aretz after 40 years in the Midbar, after learning Torah from Moshe and Aaron, after having heard, from Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the tremendous kedusha and the importance of the land of Israel. That's what they want to do because of some green grass. I mean, if one person would ask that, but Gad and Reuven, we're talking about hundreds of thousands of people. There must have been lots of leaders and Talmidei Chachamim and thinking people. It's not conceivable. It's not conceivable that really they'd be willing to give up the land of Israel for some green grass. The whole request sounds so stupid to be really, there must be a backstory here. There must be a hidden theme here. And the answer is there are several hidden themes. There are several hidden reasons. But before we go to the hidden reasons, let's just think for a minute what Moshe Rabbeinu answers them. He first of all gives them a very severe a rebuke, a very severe Mussar drasha. He says, really? Do you really think that you want to stay here and reject the land of Israel? If you do that, you're undermining the morale of the whole of the land of Israel. All the Jewish people will misread this. They'll say, you want to stay here because you're afraid of battle, right? This, says Moshe Rabbeinu, this is a replay of the Meraglim. You're making the same mistake. Koi asu avoseichem, Moshe Rabbeinu says. This is exactly what your ancestors did at the story of the Meraglim. They came to Israel and they said, no, we won't go into the land of Israel. We're going to stay here, not go into the land of Israel. It's a terrible mistake, right? The amazing thing also, though, about this story is that by the time we get to the end of this story, sorry, I'm just moving my phone around a little bit. By the time we get to the end of this story, Moshe Rabbeinu, in fact, says to them, yes, it's a good idea. You stay here and you will inherit Transjordan only on condition. What was the condition? And you join the rest of the Jewish people in their battles for 14 years. They were conquering and settling the land of Israel under the leadership of Yeshua. If you can do that, then you can then go back to Transjordan and settle down there and everybody's happy. Now, if Transjordan is Chutz La'aretz, right? And if the whole point really of the Jewish people going through the Midbar and coming to the land of Israel is in order to settle in Eretz Yisrael, the land of Abraham, Yitzchak, and Yaakov, the land that eventually the Beis Hamikdash will be built. Why does Moshe agree? Moshe could simply have said to them, no, obviously you must go into Eretz Yisrael. I don't want you to live in Chutz La'aretz. So there must be something else going on here. Oh, just 1 second. I think the electricity has just come on again. Electricity has just come on again. Let's see if we can, bear with me, ladies and gentlemen. I'm really sorry about this. Let's see if we can get back to normal service. This too will be resumed in 1 moment. We can do this. It'll take the Wi-Fi a few minutes. It's going to take a few minutes for the Wi-Fi, so it's not quite there. First of all, the request didn't make sense, but even more surprisingly, why would Moshe Rabbeinu agree to let them live in Chutz La'aretz on the other side of the Jordan? Why would he do that? They're part of the land of Israel, they're part of the Jewish people. They should be living in Eretz Yisrael. So why does he say yes at the end? He could simply have refused their. Okay, so this is really a very fascinating subject. But to get to the bottom of it, we have to look at Parshas Lech Lecha, 1 or 2. Right? HaKadosh Baruch Hu had said to them, they're going to go into the land of Israel. And here they're suddenly saying, oh, I think the Wi-Fi is back again. Okay, ladies and gentlemen, another 2-minute hiatus.
Our apologies, a full refund will be available. You could get a refund out of Elal, you'll get a refund out of me.
Okay.
Recording in progress.
Okay.
Second.
Should be leaving us and entering.
Unmute, Rabbi.
Right, can you hear me, ladies and gentlemen?
Yes.
Okay, we
Better.
are back.
We
We
are
are
back.
back in action again.
Good.
Thank God, the Wi-Fi has been restored, and as you all know, we can't live without Wi-Fi. 10 years ago, we didn't know what it was. Today, we can't live without it. That's a strange thing about life, modern life. Okay. So what I was going to say to you is, there is something in Parshas Lech Lecha and the Bris Bein Absorim, which is the origin of the promise to Avraham Avinu about the land of Israel, which is a mafteach, which is a key to begin understanding the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven story. As I say, both the request is extraordinary, that they would have decided to, after 40 years of dreaming of Israel, on the threshold of Israel, they would ask, we're going to stay here because of some green grass, right? And secondly, the response was extraordinary. The Moshe Rabbeinu says, yes, it's true, he gave them the condition that they would fight with them, but why did he say yes? He could have said no. So what is really going on here? So that's what I want to show you, something very interesting here. Let's get back to our text. Okay, 1 second. Right. Okay. Right. Text up. Ellie, can you see the text? Yes? Good. Thank you. So the first thing Moshe Rabbeinu says to them is, okay, because we've lost a little bit of time, let's go straight to the Parshas Lech Lecha. So here it says in Parshas Lech Lecha, let's have a look at this whole Parsha here. This whole Parsha reads, right? We didn't focus on it so much when we looked at it the first time. Bayomahu, on that day, Koras Hashem as Avram. It's like his name hasn't even been changed yet to Avraham. Can you see that? This is before the Bris Milah. This is the first covenant, the covenant of Bris Ben Absarim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu made a covenant with Avram, Lamar saying, "L'zarcha nosati es haaretz hazos." That this land will become the property of your zarach, of your descendants. And how big is this land? I want you to pay attention to the boundaries that HaKadosh Baruch Hu tells Moshe Rabbeinu here, tells Avraham Avinu here at the Bris Ben Absarim. He says to him, how big is the land? The land is, look at this, Min Nahar Mitzrayim ad Nahar Paros, from the Nile to the Euphrates. Now, the Nile to the Euphrates, anyone who has even the slightest familiarity with the map will know that from the Nile to the Euphrates is a much bigger territory than what we normally consider to be the land of Israel, right? Particularly significant for our purposes today is that that area includes the whole of Transjordan, what is today Jordan and Syria, right? And the whole of Transjordan is included in that description. So Avraham Avinu is getting a massive promise from HaKadosh Baruch Hu that this land will one day belong to Klal Yisrael. And then he goes on, again, somewhat unnecessarily at this point, because don't forget, Avraham Avinu, the truth is Avraham Avinu himself never inherits any land. He only gets the covenant. But the claim to Eretz Yisrael that we have today is this covenant. And then he goes on to say, to give us a list. What is this list? Right? The list is, right? Hakeni, Aknizi, Akadmoni, Achiti, Aprizi, Araphaim, Amori, Aknani, Agoshi, Ayebusi. These are all the nations or tribes, the warrior tribes, who are currently indigenous to the land of Canaan, and the land which they occupy, that is going to become the land of Israel. So if you look at this list, you're struck by something very interesting. How many nations are written here? How many nations are in this list? Right? Keni, Knizi, Kadmoni, Chiti, Prizi, Rephaim, Emori, Kanani, Girgashi, Yebusi, 10 nations. HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives to Avraham Avinu the land of 10 nations. Right? Fast forward to Parshas Va'eschanan. In Parshas Va'eschanan in Devarim chapter 7, Moshe Rabbeinu is telling Klal Yisrael, sort of in the last few weeks of his life in Parshas Devarim, Sefer Devarim, he's giving them a sort of an introduction to the land of Israel. And look what he says: Ki yaviacha Hashem Elokecha el haaretz. HaKadosh Baruch Hu is about to bring you into the land. Asher ata bo shama l'rishta, and you'll come there and you'll inherit it forever. And he says, V'noshal goyim rabim miponecha, and HaKadosh Baruch Hu will push aside, will get rid of many nations in order for you to settle the land. How many nations? Achiti, Agirgashi, Oemori, Aknani, Aprizi, Achibi, Vayebusi. And in case you haven't counted them, the pasuk says, Shiva Goyim, 7 nations. Rabim va'atsumim mimcha. And they are all much more numerous and more militarily powerful than you. And in this pasuk, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying to Klal Yisrael, you should know from the very beginning, the whole enterprise of conquering and settling the land of Israel was, in a sense, impossible, right? Logically impossible. We're outgunned and outnumbered many times over. But HaKadosh Baruch Hu says to them, that's the plan. The plan is you're going into the land of Israel and you will conquer it against all odds and against all predictions. But what land is it? It's the land of the 7 nations. And indeed, throughout the Tanakh, Eretz Canaan is referred to as Eretz Shivat Ha'amim, the land of the 7 nations, right? But in Bereshis, that's not what Avraham was promised. He was promised the land of 10 nations, right? So Rashi picks this up. So this is Rashi on Parshas Lech Lecha, right? So Rashi on Parshas Lech Lecha, writes as follows. Rashi says, Es hakeni. Can you see the highlighted text? Rashi says, Esa umos yeshka. See, Rashi can also count. In Lech Lecha, he says there were 10 nations. But actually, Yeshua only gives them the land of the 7 nations. The Hashlosha, so what are the 3 missing ones? So Rashi is now quoting the Sifri, quoting Chazal, giving us an insight into what are the 3 that were mentioned to Avraham but were missing later on to Klal Yisrael. So Rashi says, Edom, Moab, right here Rashi says, Edom, Moab, Va'amon. Just by the way, Edom, Moab, and Ammon are different to all the other 7 because all the other 7 are completely nations from a different genealogy. But Edom, Moab, and Ammon are all cousins of Klal Yisrael, right? Edom comes from Esav, and Ammon and Moab come from Lot, who was a nephew of Avraham Avinu. So Edom and Moab and Ammon, so they were all idolatrous, and they weren't part of the Jewish people, but they were relatives, and their land was adjacent to the land of Israel on the other side of the Jordan, right? And they are called, so Rashi tells us that for some reason that we're not told, these nations are given a name in the Chumash, these 3 names, Keni, Knizi, Kadmoni, are simply different names for Edom, Moab, and Ammon, meaning what? Transjordan. Let's just summarize so far. Avraham Avinu is promised the land of Israel, including Transjordan. Moshe Rabbeinu tells the Jewish people, you will inherit the land of Israel minus Transjordan. You will inherit the land of Israel only that which is west of the Jordan River, but not east of the Jordan River. So what about Canaan? So why is Avraham Avinu promised this land? Says Rashi, right? Here's the Rashi. Rashi says that Asidim lios lerusha la'osid. What does that mean? Asidim lios lerusha la'osid. And you can see in brackets he quotes Bereshis Rabbi, Chazal in the Medrash. Rashi says that Transjordan is a promise to Avraham Avinu, but it's a promise only la'atid. What is the atid? It's talking about la'osid lovoi, in the messianic world. You know, as part of our vision of a redeemed world is the land of Israel with larger borders, including Transjordan. And it brings a pasuk in Yeshaya chapter 11, where Yeshaya chapter 11 is a famous chapter dealing with all the details of the vision of Yeshaya of Yemos HaMashiach. What will the world look like in the time of Mashiach? Right? Yeshaya writes, "Ki mitzion teitzei Torah udvar Hashem Yerushalayim," that the message and the teachings and the values of the Torah will emanate from Yerushalayim and from Tzion and will go worldwide, will affect all the nations of the world. Not that they'll all become Jewish, but they will recognize the truth and the validity of the Torah and of the Jewish people. That's part of Yeshaya's vision of Yemos HaMashiach. And in that vision, it says, Shanema, I'm reading now the pasuk on the screen, Shanema Edom u'Moab mishloach Yodom u'vnei Ammon mishmatom, that Edom, Moab, and Ammon will all be swallowed up by the land of Israel, because the borders of Israel will have expanded into also into Transjordan. So let's just summarize for a minute what we've learned here, because these are extremely important pieces of knowledge to understand how the Torah and how Chazal understood the status of Transjordan. Now, Transjordan, is it part of Israel or isn't it part of Israel? So the answer is not a clear yes and no answer. The answer is that the whole of Transjordan was part of the promise to Avraham Avinu. There's no question about it. His promise was Minahar Mitzrayim and Nahar Pros, including 10 nations, including Edom, Ammon, and Moab. But in reality, Klal Yisrael only inherited on the west of the Jordan, not the east of the Jordan. But Transjordan, the point that what I'd like to make to you this morning, particularly relevant to the story of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, is that Transjordan is not Chutz La'aretz. It's not Chutz La'aretz. Transjordan is, in fact, that part of Eretz Yisrael which is not yet fully available to us, but actually is part of the Messianic vision, part of the promise of the Bris Bein Absarim. When HaKadosh Baruch Hu makes a covenant, that covenant is an unbreakable covenant. We have a covenant from HaKadosh Baruch Hu, like we have a covenant for Eretz Yisrael, we have a covenant for Transjordan as well. Only, for whatever reason it is, and we're not told of the reason, when Yeshua takes them into the land of Israel, he is told that they're only going to inherit at the moment Shiva So'amim, the 7 nations. And therefore, if we now have another look at the request of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, please let us stay here, they're not saying we want to stay in Chutz La'aretz and not coming to Eretz Yisrael. What they're saying is, we have just conquered this land miraculously, right? Og Melech HaBashan, Sichon Melech HaAmori, and Chemes Midian were all won miraculously. If HaKadosh Baruch Hu miraculously has helped us to conquer this land, Transjordan, it must mean that we are able to make use of it already now. Already now. It's true that the land of Israel proper is only on the other side of the Jordan, but this land on the east of the Jordan is also part of the land of Israel, and they're not wrong. Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven were not wrong. They were just a bit ahead of their time. Right? It wasn't time yet for Transjordan to become part of Eretz Yisrael, but it was definitely part of the original Brit, was part of the covenant. And because it was part of the covenant, they were able to make this request. And because it was part of the covenant, Moshe Rabbeinu was able to say to them, yes. Moshe Rabbeinu would never have said yes to Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven if their request had been, let's live in Egypt, or let's live in Syria, let's live in Chutz La'aretz. But they said, let's live in Transjordan, and that's part of the covenant with Avraham Avinu. So Moshe Rabbeinu says, yes, let's do that. You can stay in Transjordan, and by staying in Transjordan, Klal Yisrael, the Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, in fact, consecrated the land. In other words, the land itself became part of Am Yisrael. And this was a very important, deeper insight into Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, which you only understand if you've learned Bereshis properly, and you've understood the covenant with Avraham Avinu properly, and then you understand what Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven are claiming. But I'd like to take this one stage further. I actually want to, a quarter of an hour left, I want to take it 2 stages further. But let's take it first 1 stage further, and that takes us into another very interesting topic in the Torah, which is the Orei Miklot, right? The cities of refuge. You see, I've written here, the next text is from the cities of refuge, Parsha Shoftim. Anybody know? Can anybody tell us what the cities of refuge were designed to do? What were the Ori Miklat? What were they there for? Any offers?
To protect a murderer, the shogeg, someone who killed by accident.
Right. That if someone killed by accident, right, we couldn't execute him because it was inadvertent, it was accident. Nevertheless, he had to go into Golos, into one of the cities of refuge. How many cities of refuge were there? Anybody remember? So the answer is there were 6. There were 6 cities of refuge, right? Without going too much into the details, there were 3 in one area, 3 in the other area, right? And then, so what is the point of these cities? Also, careful, it gives an example. It gives an example of someone who goes into the forest. Right, this pasuk just gives. I'll just take out one pasuk out of this parsha. Somebody who is in the forest with his friends, lachtov eitzim, and he's chopping trees. V'nidche yodo bagarzen, lichros ha'eitz, and in the process of chopping trees, the axe, the head of the axe, flies off its handle. Wasn't so well secured to the handle. But noshar habarzel min ha'eitz, and the barzel, the metal axe top, flies off the handle, motzos ra'ehu, and hits the other person who mace. And the other person dies. Now the person, the killer here was completely unintentional. He was just a forester. But he has been responsible for another person's death. Inadvertently. What should he do? Says the pasuk, Hu Yonus al achas ha'orim eila v'chai. He is allowed to go to live in one of these cities, and there he can live. I'm not going to go into this whole parsha at the moment. It's a very, very interesting parsha. The truth is, every legal system in the world differentiates between levels of, there's a difference between murder and manslaughter and unintentional death. There are all sorts of different legal levels of having tragically caused somebody else's death, depending on levels of intentionality, what your kavana was. So here we have, it's a whole sugya. If you've learned Maseches Makos, you'll know that this is a very sophisticated sugya in the Gemara. Exactly what type of inadvertent life-taking we're talking about, how it works, how long he has to stay there, what he does when he's there, a complicated subject. But I'm just telling you this for one reason, because Moshe Rabbeinu says to them that you've got to make 6 cities, and look what he says here in the end. In Parshas Shoftim, in Sefer Devarim, he says, V'im yarchiv Hashem elokecha es gevulecha. What's he saying here? He's saying there will come a time when HaKadosh Baruch Hu harchiv. What's the harchiv? To expand your boundary, your borders. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will expand your borders. Ka'asher nishba la'avos. Here Moshe Rabbeinu is really for the first time conceding that there was a shavua, there was a promise by HaKadosh Baruch Hu, la'avosecha, to your ancestors. You were promised a much bigger land than you got. So here Moshe Rabbeinu in this context says, Im yarchiv Hashem elokecha gevulecha ka'asher nishba la'avosecha. Like HaKadosh Baruch Hu promised your ancestors, the nosan lachos kol ha'oretz asher diber loseis la'avosecha, and he gives all the land. So you can see here in this pasuk almost explicitly, Moshe Rabbeinu is saying there is the land that you've inherited, the land of the 7 nations, but there is something else. There is the land promised to Avraham Avinu, and the time will come when you will get the whole land. So Rashi here says the What does Rashi here say? In what way will this land be increased? Says Rashi, that you will inherit the land of Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni. This Rashi you have to link up with the Rashi in Parshas Lech Lecha, and you find out that Keni, Knizi, and Kadmoni means Edom, Ammon, and Moab. It means basically Transjordan. So the pasuk here is clearly saying that even though Klal Yisrael went with Yoshua into the land of Israel, it wasn't the whole land of Israel that was given to Yoshua. It was only part of it. And that throws a whole new light. And the Ramban here is a long Ramban, but I just really brought you here the first line of the Ramban. The Ramban says, can you see this? Parsha hazu asida. This pasuk is dealing with the atid lavo, is dealing with the a situation which will only happen in the end of time, at the time of the messianic redemption, the time of Yemos Mashiach, then that will happen. So here you have, right. So let's just summarize here in the last 10 minutes of the share. What I wanted to show you was that by learning Parshas Bereshis, Sefer Bereshis, and the Bris Bein Abasarim, you discover two things: that there was a covenant for Eretz Yisrael, that the Jewish people will inherit the land of Israel, and even Ben Gurion, who was not, as you know, a Shema Mitzvahs, who wasn't a halachically observant Jew, but he said publicly on many, many occasions, he said that the claim that we have to the land of Israel is based on the Tanakh. The Tanakh is our mandate. It was a line that Ben Gurion used a few times. What rights do we have for the land of Israel? How do we know that it's ours? Only from the Tanakh. And the primary source in the Tanakh is Lech Lecha, right? Is Bereshis, Sefer Bereshis, and Lech Lecha is the bris, the covenant in Lech Lecha to get the land. So in actual fact, looking at this covenant, we see that the covenant included Transjordan, and therefore Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven were not saying we want to stay in Chutz La'aretz. They were saying we feel that maybe the time has come so that we can really realize the entire covenant made with Avraham Avinu, which includes Transjordan. So this is, I think, a bit of an important insight. But I just want to end that with one very beautiful idea. So you might say, okay, so what is the... so we know that Transjordan is also part of the land of Israel. If I'm not mistaken, some of you might know this history better than me, in the 1922 League of Nations, when they gave a validity to Palestine to be the Jewish homeland, the map of Israel actually included Transjordan. Now, Transjordan was part of the original dividing up of the land that was decided. Does anyone know any details about this? Maybe more than I do. I'm not such an expert in this, in the history of this, but the original 1922 decision to put into action the Balfour Declaration and to provide a homeland for the Jewish people, the land of Israel included the whole of Transjordan. It was only later on the British mandate decided to chop it down and give the eastern parts of Jordan to the Hashemite kingdom, but that was a decision by the Foreign Office later on. But the original idea of the Jewish homeland was Transjordan as well, and that comes, I think, from a correct reading of the biblical text, as we've just been learning. But you could still ask the question: what really motivated Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven to want that land. They must have wanted it very bad, right? To be able to say, we're going to give up our portion of the land of Israel proper to take this part of the land of Israel, which isn't completely yet designated for us. So here's a very interesting subject, which only comes up later in the Chumash. Because Moshe Rabbeinu, in the parsha we read a few days ago, Moshe Rabbeinu is very severely critical of them. And he calls them Tarbus Anoshim Chatoim. He calls them, you are sinners by asking this question, making this request. What he has in mind particularly is that it will affect the Jewish people badly, will undermine their morale for fighting the battles. But in actual fact, in the end, he agrees. And in the end of Devarim, I just want to tell you the end of this story. This story, Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuben, starts in Lech Lecha, but it ends in V'zos HaBracha. In V'zos HaBracha, right? I haven't got the text up for you, so you'll have to take my word for it. In V'zos HaBracha, each tribe gets a blessing from Moshe Rabbeinu, right? What does he say to the tribe of Gad? To the tribe of Gad, he says the following words: Vayar Reishis Loi, that he saw and he took the Reishit. What is the Reishit? The Reishit means the first fruits, the first product. Says Rashi, the Reishis of Kibush Haaretz, the very first part of the conquest of the land was taken by Gad and Reuven. Now, if Transjordan is Chutz Laaretz, then it's not the beginning of the Kibush Haaretz. So it's clear from that Rashi that the Reishis of Gad is the beginning of Eretz Yisrael. But then he goes on to say something very, very beautiful, and I think very moving in a certain sense. Why did they want Transjordan? So their story was, the grass is green here, but we've already agreed that that doesn't make sense. That wouldn't be enough of, first of all, how did they know there wasn't good green grass on the other side as well? How did they know that? Maybe there was. Kadosh Baruch Hu promised them a land flowing with milk and honey. So why did they suddenly fall in love with the grass here? So Moshe Rabbeinu suddenly came to a realization at the end of his life, what was the real motive of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. So the Pasuk continues there, Vayar Reishis Lo, Kishom, right? Why did he want that piece of land? Because Kishom there, Chelkas Mechokek Safun. What do these three words mean? So a chelka is a word we still use today to mean a burial ground. A burial plot is called in Hebrew a chelka. It comes from the word chelek, which means a piece of land, but a chelka is a particular word used for not any piece of land. It means for a burial plot. And whose burial plot was it? It was the burial plot of the mechokek. Who? Anybody know any offers on the word mechokek? What does that mean, mechokek? Any ideas? Okay, mechokek comes from the word chayk, which means a law.
Giver.
What do you say?
Sorry, lawgiver, essentially.
Lawgiver, the lawgiver. In fact, in modern Hebrew and Ivrit, right, they speak about the Knesset. The Knesset has got a koach mechokek, has the power to legislate new laws. But in the Chumash, the mechokek, the lawgiver, was Moshe Rabbeinu. He was the person who gave us the Chukei Chayim, the laws of the Torah. So the Chelkas Mechokek means the burial plot of Moshe Rabbeinu. And what does Safun mean? Safun means hidden. So we know from the Pasuk that the actual location of the burial plot of Moshe Rabbeinu is hidden. Nobody knows where it is, right? But we do know one thing, that it was in Transjordan. Was in that Transjordan area, and the Gemara in Sota's got a whole debate. Was it in the Bnei Gad area or Bnei Reuven area? But whatever it was in Transjordan. So Moshe Rabbeinu is saying his bracha to God in the end. He says, I know really why you wanted to stay in Transjordan. Because you wanted to have a connection to my burial place. In other words, and this is a bit of a longer story. The Sfas Emes speaks about it. The Meshech Chochmah speaks about it. Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven, they had a very strong connection to Moshe Rabbeinu. And they felt it's unthinkable that we'll let Moshe Rabbeinu die and be buried in Transjordan, And we're simply going to say thank you and goodbye, and we're going to move on into Eretz Yisrael and leave Moshe Rabbeinu totally disconnected from the land of Israel and the people of Israel. That's not possible. So, but on the other hand, HaKadosh Baruch Hu has HaKadosh Baruch Hu has told Moshe Rabbeinu he can't enter the land of Israel. So here you have, and this is the closing minute of the Shia, this is an example of a Yiddish Kop, right? The Yiddish Kop of Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven was like this. Moshe can't come into the land of Israel, but we can bring the land of Israel to Moshe Rabbeinu. We can, if we take this part of land and we settle here and consecrate it as part of Am Yisrael, we have actually created a new reality. And the reality is that Moshe Rabbeinu was buried in Israel. Maybe not in Israel proper, but in that part of Israel, which is part of L'Asiv Lavo, part of the Messianic dream, and we will consecrate it by living here. And therefore, it's the Torah equivalent of the line which I've heard sometimes about Muhammad coming to the mountain, and the mountain. How does that go exactly? If Muhammad won't go to the mountain will come to Muhammad, right? So in Jewish literature, that's what Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven. If Moshe can't come to Israel, Israel will come to Moshe. We are going to create Eretz Yisrael in Transjordan because there's a basis for it in the promise given to Abraham Avinu, and by doing so, we're creating a new reality that Moshe was buried in Eretz Yisrael. Moshe, we're not losing our connection with Moshe Rabbeinu, and that was really their goal. And Moshe Rabbeinu realized it in the last day of his life when he was giving them brachas. He said, he understood that that's what they wanted. They wanted the connection to him. And that's it for today, ladies and gentlemen. A bit of a new insight into Avraham Avinu, Transjordan, and Bnei Gad and Bnei Reuven.